I request Professor Tayyiba to introduce our third speaker, Professor Talal Waqar.
Pleasure to introduce Professor Talal Waqar, who is currently working as Professor of Pediatrics and Consultant Neonatologist at CMH Medical College, Lahore. He's also an examiner and supervisor for FCPS in neonatology at CPSP. He has authored a book and he has multiple papers to his credit. He's going to talk about a very interesting topic, neonatal encephalopathy, thinking beyond HIE, but when? I welcome Professor Talal Waqar.
Thank you, Professor Tayyiba, for such a generous introduction. I thank the team of Children's Hospital Lahore for inviting me at this August gathering and speaking on a very important topic. What we are going to discuss in next couple of minutes, probably 30 minutes or so, as Professor Sajid Makul has rightly pointed out earlier this morning, that there are multiple challenges in neonatal neurology and even definitions keep on changing. So I'm going to take you to a journey of the definition of encephalopathy, starting from asphyxia to shifting over to HIE and then zooming out to encephalopathy. We are going to discuss a bit of causes of encephalopathy, which start from preconceptional and antenatal causes. How much does intrapartum play its own role into encephalopathy? Some placental abnormalities which cause this issue, maternal and fetal infections, a touch on fetal factors and inherited metabolic disorders. We'll try to conclude something. I use the word we'll try to. What we are not going to discuss is HIE per se. And that is going to be discussed in a workshop by Professor Sajjad Rahman, probably this evening or tomorrow. I have a disclosure to make for this present talk. Whenever I come across a baby with encephalopathy, this has been my thought. It's an ethical disclosure that I've always thought that OBGY, and somebody is nodding his head here that they also think so. Well, we are not alone. When I looked at the literature, I found out that this friction has been there since ages. And it started out somewhere in 15th century when people saw babies with encephalopathy and tried to define what exactly are they facing with. They labeled them as baby having apparent death, syncope, apoplexy, asphyxia livida, asphyxia pallida. Then came the famous description, perinatal asphyxia, birth asphyxia. So we've come a long way from here to here. But in 1992, American College of Obs and Gynae thought that it's time to redefine things and tried to tackle this dilemma and this conundrum. So they came up with this thought that perinatal asphyxia is rather a very imprecise term. The term should be abandoned, but it has not taken place till now. And unless we have a pH of less than 7.0, accompanied with significant metabolic acidosis, and there is an abnormal neonatal course, it is very difficult to say that the baby is suffering from perinatal asphyxia. As part of sorting out this issue, again a new terminology was coined, which we all know and which all use quite often, and that is hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. But interestingly, we know that it requires lots of criteria for its diagnosis, which includes a pH less than 7.0, a base excess minus 12, involvement of multi-organ failure, involvement of an APGAR scores, abnormal neonatal outcome, And interestingly, we need all 4 of them to fulfill the criteria and label a baby suffering from hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy secondary to hypoxia. So the problem never solved. In 1992, if you look at the literature, this is a seminal paper which came from Badawi's group, Nadia, from Australia. I'll give a reference of this research quite a lot in my talk. They looked at 164 newborns with encephalopathy. And to their surprise, they found that 70% cases were not associated with any evidence of intrapartum asphyxia. Then our very own, I call it own because we are very fond of Mr. Nelson and Professor Nelson. So it was time to, again, he thought that we need to reconsider it. And they wrote an editorial in the BMJ that it's time to reconsider the causes of encephalopathy and give it a fresh thought. Around 10 years ago, again, American Academy of Pediatrics and Gynecology, along with our pediatric community, they sat down and came up with this seminal document, which is a 250-pager document, which enlists lots of causes of encephalopathy and when to label a baby as encephalopathy. So they suggest that we need to look at a broader picture. And what is the broader picture actually? The term encephalopathy should not be used synonymous with hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. HIE is only one of the cause of encephalopathy. So they came up with a fresh definition that baby having altered sensorium with sublevel consciousness accompanied with seizures, may be having respiratory difficulty, abnormal tone and reflexes, should be labeled as having encephalopathy. So we come to one conclusion in last 5 to 6 slides is that HIE is not equivalent to encephalopathy per se, and both are different. HIE is one of the cause of encephalopathy. So what are the details that suggest that we are probably not dealing with HIE? An ABGAR score of more than 7 at 5 minutes of age. If you have presence of other risk factors, abnormal fetal growth or maternal risk factors and placental lesions, I'll talk about the lesions in a minute. Cord arterial pH of more than 7.2, absence of characteristic MRI findings of HIE, we all know it's the deep gray matter basal ganglia involvement. If they are absent, or there is presence of other sort of focal lesions, then it's very, very unlikely that we are dealing with HIE as a cause of encephalopathy. Please, I am using the word unlikely. So what are the prenatal and perinatal causal pathway to neonatal injury? Now, the problem can be anywhere from hair to hair. Right from the conception, there could be problems. Then, as Dr. Huck has already pointed out in his morning talk, we could have problems here. And if we are having I'll use the word defective fetus, that defective fetus is likely to land himself into trouble. And this concept has been further highlighted. There are distal risk factors which take place somewhere here, which include genetic abnormalities and environmental factors. And then there's an already compromised fetus. So now this already compromised fetus is more at risk of developing complications intrapartum. So there are many causal pathways to encephalopathy, and we need to look into them. I'm not going to go into this detail at all. I'm not going to bug you on it. But this slide just tells you that there are so many causes. So let's have a look at only a few of them. And what is the evidence that we have for them? Excuse me. There are preconceptional risk factors, and I said I'll point it out again to that seminal paper. Nadia looked at 164 newborns with encephalopathy and looked at the risk factors. If you have a family history of seizures, you are twice likely to develop encephalopathy. If you have a family history of neurological disorders, again twice likely to have problems. Infertility treatment, something like confidence interval of 1.1 to 17 times more likely for a baby to land into trouble. Now, the same study also looked at antenatal risk factors. Those were prenatal risk factors. Now I'm talking about antenatal risk factors. A maternal history of thyroid disease, you're 9 times more likely to develop encephalopathy. Preeclampsia, which is fairly common in our part of the world also, you are 7 times more likely to develop encephalopathy. Any viral illness, around 3 times more incidence, and same goes with vaginal bleeding. So now when the same study looked at intrapartum risk factors, it was very interesting what they found out. They found out that only 4% of cases were associated with hypoxia per se. Again, I said 69% were antepartum. There were a combination of two, around 25 and 29, 30% of these. But 69% were again antepartum risk factors. And the insult could have happened anywhere. That insult may lead to encephalopathy and trouble intrapartum itself. So intrapartum hypoxia, what the literature says is that it contributes only to a small number of babies having encephalopathy. The world was not convinced, neither I am, and probably not you also, with only 164 babies. So let's look at a larger cohort. Again, the Vermont-Oxford network, which Professor Irfan is also one of the part of it, they in 2012 looked at their registry of around 4,000 babies with encephalopathy, and they found that 46% cases of encephalopathy, the cause was something predating labor, much before the delivery. And what were these causes? Around 15 to 60% mom had hypertension, some had diabetes. Again, the fetus was small, around 60%, 8% had birth defects. So a large sample confirms now that non-asphyxiatal factors are also important. I'm using the word also. Mind you, I've used the terminologies as unlikely because there are lots of gray areas in the whole thing still. Excuse me. Okay. Now, we've looked at maternal factors, we've looked at prenatal factors, we've looked at a bit of evidence, and what does the world say? Placental abnormalities. Now, placenta forms a very, very important part of our whole milieu of investigations or clinical features or whatever information we do have with us. Whenever there's an air crash, we need to find the black box. And people have synonymously used it with encephalopathic baby. If you have an encephalopathic baby, you need to look at the placenta. And unfortunately, in our part of the world, it forms a nice feed for cats and mice behind the labor ward. So what are the recommendations? The recommendations from American Academy, as well as Britishers, as well as pathologists and obstetricians, RCPCH, they all recommend that a placenta should be examined in all cases of encephalopathy. And I'm sure professors and seniors sitting in front would bear me out that those who have practiced abroad know that examination of placenta forms a very, very important part of any issues any neonatal issues, and specifically, these are the recommendations from all our premier institutes. What can be the placental abnormalities? With chorioamnionitis, you are 2 times more likely to develop encephalopathy. 5 to 10% cases of encephalopathy were related to villitis. Other issues could be fusitis, umbilical cord knots, and it has interestingly been seen that this risk is exponential. The greater the number of placental lesions and placental anomalies you have, the greater the risk of a baby falling into trouble and developing encephalopathy and later on cerebral palsy. Again, people looked at placenta. There's a study done in America where they looked at the encephalopathic babies, and then they looked at the placenta of encephalopathic babies, and then they looked at the sentinel events. With sentinel events, we mean that any event which occurs very close to the time of delivery. You can call it a peripartum event or an intrapartum event. Only 30% of placentas of babies with encephalopathy had some evidence of sentinel event, while the rest never had any evidence. So placental abnormalities are an important risk factor for neonatal encephalopathy. So what we need to do is, we need to tell our OB/GY colleagues that we need to save the placenta instead of sending it over to rats and mice. Okay, let's look at fetal-maternal infections. Fetal-maternal infections, again, as Dr. Huq also pointed out in the morning, intrauterine infection is a major cause of trouble, far more than perinatal asphyxia itself. Because when there is an initiation of immune response, a well-formed structure may become damaged. We are talking of brain in this case, and there is adaptive immune response triggering also. And that leads to non-inflammatory injury, neuroinflammatory injury, not only destroying what exists, but also changing what develops. We all know that there is a release of cytokines from the placenta. These cytokines, which include interleukin-6 and other tumor necrotic factors, they cause activation of the fetal microglia, which leads to death of neurons and death of oligodendrocytes. And this baby, if exposed to infections intrauterine, is likely to have trouble. So what are the causative organisms when we look at fetal-maternal infections? No doubt in the Western population, it is group B streptococcus, group B streptococcus. Those who have practiced abroad would know that group B streptococcus is an alarming name in the West. Other causes also include E. coli, listeria, some viral causes, and some torch infection. The meta-analysis published from the West says that the baby is at 2 times greater risk of death if encephalopathy is associated with GBS disease. What about our population? I also looked at a bit of figures. We do not have GBS, that's what we say. Yes, probably we don't have it. But chorioamnionitis and prolonged rupture of membranes, Aga Khan Medical College looked at it a couple of years ago. We have Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, and E. coli. Mind you, E. coli was listed in the previous slide also. It may be an important cause of encephalopathy. But looking at very fresh literature, the ANISA study from AKU tells us that yes, we have these 3 Klebsiella, E. coli, but we may also be having ureaplasma. Does it contribute to encephalopathy? I do not know, because we do not have any data as such. But that's a food for thought for younger colleagues. What other what other infections can lead to encephalopathy? Herpes simplex virus, 1 in 20,000 to 30,000 cases, 30% have encephalopathy, and herpes 2 is more associated with encephalopathy. And if you have a new infection, mom has a new infection, the risk is far more than when mom has a reactivation of the old infection. The baby may present with rash or isolated seizures, a picture of sepsis, leading a baby to encephalopathic picture. I've got 5 minutes left, okay. Fetal factors, let's look at them. The birth weight is an important component. Babies who have less than third centile weight are 38 times more likely to fall into trouble at the time of delivery, and that includes SGA as well as intrauterine growth restricted babies. We have no dearth of these in our country. Fetal factors also include multiple gestations, greater risk of cerebral palsy and encephalopathy. It depends upon the chorionicity and the birth order. If there is a demise of one fetus, the other is likely to fall into trouble. Post-maturity per se is also a risk factor, and as the gestation increases beyond 40 weeks, the risk starts increasing. We are very fond of labeling babies with inherited metabolic disorders. Yes, it forms an important component of our diagnostic differential diagnosis when we are dealing with a baby with encephalopathy. But just let me tell you, it is a rare cause. Yes, we don't know the figures in our part of the world, and with consanguinity, the figures may be very high, but we still do not have the figures. What are the inherited metabolic disorders which we should think when we have any baby who is encephalopathic? It's very simple. There is accumulation of a substrate. Either there is lack of a product, or there's an alternative shift pathway which causes toxicity to the brain. The baby normally presents within the first 1 week with encephalopathic picture, or any one of these, which include seizures, acidosis. What are we supposed to look at? 3 major things to look at: ammonia, glucose, and acidosis. I'll just take a brief 1-minute slide for each one of them. With hyperammonemia, we know it's a byproduct of protein metabolism. There is breakdown of protein. It is excreted as urea. If there is any problem in any one of the pathways, either a liver or any one of the pathways, there is increased production of ammonia. Common ammonia disorders include organic acidemias, which include, so there is significant ammonia elevation, and only important thing is that we need to consider hyperammonemia only when the serum ammonia level is fairly high. Normally people label it as a disorder of ammonia cycle disorders or urea cycle disorders, even with a very small elevation. That's not the point. The treatment is fairly simple. You need to stop proteins, give benzyl benzoate. In severe cases, you need to do hemodialysis. With metabolic acidosis, you need to look at anion gap. Lactic acidosis causes energy deficiency. Organic acidemias, common ones are isovaleric acidemias, propionic acidemias, and methylmalonic acidemias. They all present with an encephalopathic picture in a baby. Carnitine is needed. B12 sometimes are responsive, biotin sometimes you can give. You need to look at blood sugar also. Common disorders are fatty acid oxidation disorders, MCAD, LCAD, very low chain acyl carnitine deficiency disorders. There are certain things, certain disorders which do not present as with any biomarker feature, but still the baby is encephalopathic, and common one includes non-ketotic hyperglycemia, pyridoxine dependency seizures, and sulfatase oxidase deficiencies, folinic acid responsive. There's a huge list of a lot of them. So we just need to keep in mind that even if the ammonia is normal, glucose is normal, there's no acidosis, and the baby is badly encephalopathic, and you do not have any other clue, then think of these disorders. Also, a common one includes non-ketotic hyperglycinemia. The CSF to plasma glycine ratio is greater than 0.08, which is diagnostic of non-ketotic hyperglycinemia. Then there are certain structural disorders which also present as encephalopathy. The common one includes, these are the structural layers, the normal cortex that has been shown in the morning also. There is a baby who has lesioncephaly, that he may present with encephalopathy right at the time of birth or even after 2 to 3 days. I know there's a talk tomorrow on neonatal stroke to be given. Is stroke an important cause of encephalopathy? Probably not, because people from USA have looked into, and there were only 6 babies out of 104 neonatal encephalopathic babies, and only 6 of them had stroke. This was further re-endorsed by Francis Cohen and Mary Rutherford from UK, who also endorsed this study, and they looked at 197 babies, out of which only 8 were having any thrombotic disorder. So probably stroke and thrombosis does not lead to encephalopathy per se. We can never escape our genetics, what our parents have given us. If there is a pleomorphism of interleukin-6 gene, the baby is more likely to have encephalopathy, coupled with lots of other features that I have shown previously. Now, this is a red slide, and that's a take-home sort of a message for our colleagues, is that in developing world, yes, birth asphyxia and neonatal encephalopathy, most of the time it is birth asphyxia, sometimes it is encephalopathy. We need to weigh and balance and think where do we decide, sorry. Many a times it would be birth asphyxia, no doubt. But please also keep in mind that there may well be other causes than birth asphyxia, and at times there is a double hit, a double whammy sort of a thing where the baby is already compromised and he ends up with birth asphyxia also. So up till now, where are we with the international literature? Just 2 years ago, researchers have suggested that until and unless we do not know the exact causes, it is better to list encephalopathy with these 4 headings. Either it is hypoxic, that you know there is an evidence, like 4 criteria of HIE you have fulfilled. Otherwise, if there is any maternal issues, you call it inflammatory, you call it infectious, and if you have any metabolic insult and any metabolic pointers, then label it as metabolic encephalopathy. So what is the take-home thought for me was that there could be many causes of this baby having encephalopathy. Let me not blame my colleague, and let's keep our mind open and try to find as much as possible. That's what I have started thinking. I leave it to you to think more on it. Thank you very much.